Okay, we started recording now. Welcome, Dr. Timothy Kindall from United States in our educational programs in International University of Africa, Department of Archaeology in Sudan. Welcome, Dr. Tim Kindall.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Tim Kindall studied classic archaeology in Oberlin College, and he obtained his master's degree from Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in Mesopotamia history and Akkadian language and Egyptian history. In 1974, he graduated with a PhD he obtained his PhD from Brandeis University outside Boston, where he had a broader program in both Assyriology and Egyptology, as well as the archaeology of the Mediterranean and Near East world. He worked as a curator assistant in the Department of Egyptian and Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He started working at Jebel Barkal and conducted in 1987 and conducted 24 seasons at Jebel Barkal. That is very impressive, Dr. Tim. And we would love really in Sudan to know something about great scholars, those scholars who have been working in Sudan for a long time, and they have their input in the history of Sudan too. And we would love to know your story. How did you start working in Sudan? How did you move and start thinking about Sudan and Nubia and get inspired by the history of the Kushite?
Yeah, it's a funny story. My graduate specialty was the ancient Mesopotamia, and I studied Akkadian language and cuneiform tablets, and that was my specialty. And I wrote a doctoral dissertation translating some 350 cuneiform documents from a site in Iraq, and I was hired at the museum in Boston to be the specialist in ancient Near Eastern art, and it was the department was both the Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern. So so my job was to do the ancient Near Eastern, but that was 1974. But it was a very small collection, and of course the museum is most famous for its Egyptian collection, which is huge. And I didn't really know anything about Sudan when I started in 1974, but in 1976, members of the Brooklyn Museum staff came to Boston to go through the storage collection because they were preparing the exhibition, the now quite famous, the African Antiquity exhibition. It was called The Arts of Ancient Nubia and Sudan. And my job was to help them go through the collection and pick out objects for the loan. And I suddenly became aware of the fact that the museum had an enormous collection from Sudan about which I knew nothing practically. I did know, and then I became aware that the museum's famous curator of the early 20th century, George A. Reisner, had conducted, well, I don't know, let me see, probably 20 years seasons work in Sudan, excavating at Kerma, Jebel Barkal and Nuri and Kuru and Merowe, the tombs at
the royal cemeteries, yeah.
And also the Second Cataract forts. And I suddenly became aware of all of this material, and I became quite excited about it. And and after the Brooklyn show, shortly after that, I was asked to organize an exhibition for a small local museum outside Boston. And so I suggested another show about ancient Kush, and I called it Kush, Lost Kingdom of the Nile. Not because Kush was lost, but because it was
It was
lost in the,
enormous object there. They have collection there, and it's lost in the museum.
it was lost in the museum, it was lost in the public imagination.
Yeah.
And so this was enormously exciting for me, because I got to write a catalog and get many of the objects conserved and restored, um, uh, and the show went on exhibition in 1982, and it was that. And after the show was up, I got to have a sabbatical. So I decided to come to Sudan for my sabbatical and visit the sites that the museum had excavated back in 1916 to 1920. Well, I mean, it was I was able to visit all the sites for, and that was back in '82, and then I applied to. I thought it would be um, uh, worthwhile to because the site of Jebel Barkal had never been fully published by Reisner, even though he worked 4 seasons there. There was still a lot left to do and to publish, and so I applied to work at Jebel Barkal, but the Italians had a concession for the site. So my first application was rejected, but then I wrote to Dr. Sergio Donadoni, who was the director, and he said, "Oh, sure, come and work with us." And so because Donadoni was working in another part of the site, not where Reisner had worked, so he didn't care if somebody kept on working in the temples.
Mhm.
So I started there and worked there for 5 or 6 seasons. I had to skip several years in the early 90s. And then in 1999, they had a change of director at the museum, and he wasn't very interested in members of his staff doing archaeology. So I was let go from the museum, but I was able to get continued support from a lot of people and from Northeastern University across the street from the museum and their African American Studies department. And so I was able to keep on going and working there. And well, I mean, I've just been enormously lucky in being able to do this and still have a kind of a job of some sort that kept me going. But at this point now, we got funding from Qatar and then I just got a grant for 3 years to do the final publication. So I'm working on that at the moment, and it's been a journey, and I think that my conclusion is that Jebel Barkal is a much more important site than anybody ever imagined, not just for Sudanese history, but Egyptian history. And I'm almost at the point of thinking that that the origin of Egyptian kingship, at least Upper Egyptian kingship, may derive from Jebel Barkal, and that the 25th dynasty is just a kind of replay. What the Kushites thought was a replay of what had happened perhaps in the 2,000 or 3,000 years before. And I'll explain why this looks like
in our discussion.
the truth. It's a very compelling theory anyway. It's There's nothing that
we,
contradicts
we
it.
yeah, we would love to hear that theories and arguments about your
I think
work
the
in Jebel
Egyptian,
Barkal. Yeah.
I think the modern Egyptian, I think the Egyptians are not going to be very happy about
Because there's always ongoing debate about this, the origin of the states along the river Niles, and people keep asking and asking about this, and they
yeah, which is
and
older.
therefore we would love really to have you, and we're very happy to have you here in our interview program and see how do you look at the Jebel Barkal along the river Nile from your own perspective. And so that's why we came up with a question like, what is the importance of Jebel Barkal as a sacred place in the development of archaeology and political complexities along the river Nile in the ancient Sudan and Egypt? Because that's a really very important question, and we would love to hear your input in that and see how do you look at that.
Well, I think that what this is, it's an adventure into the ancient mind, the ancient worldview. How do you think of God in a world, in a pre-scientific, Nilotic geographical area, and so we look at Jebel Barkal here from the air, and what do we see? We see a completely isolated mountain. It's not very big. It's only 100 meters high, 104 meters high. It's an isolated Jebel out at, close to the Nile. I mean, there are lots of mountains like this along the Nile. But what is interesting about Jebel Barkal is, well, a number of things. Look at where it is on the map over here on the left. These are all the New Kingdom sites. We first hear about Jebel Barkal in history in the early 18th dynasty with the Jebel Barkal inscription of Thutmose III, which was found by Reisner, and it's now in Boston. But this great monument indicates that Thutmose III visited Jebel Barkal, and the stela is dated to year 47, which is about 1432 BC. I'm just guessing, I'm not exact, but it was set up fairly late in his reign. But it's clear from this stela that the Jebel Barkal was considered by the Egyptians officially, to be the primeval home of Amun of Karnak, Amun of Thebes. Now, Thebes was the central temple of Amun. It was the religious capital of Egypt at the time. And here you see it on the map. Thebes is 1,260 kilometers downstream from Jebel Barkal. To get from Thebes to Jebel Barkal, it would have taken probably, at least, depending on which way you're going, I mean, it probably would have taken at least 6 weeks to by boat, continuous traveling to get from one place to the other. And of course, you probably couldn't even get to Jebel Barkal by boat, except during the summer months, because if you look at the map, you see that the current, the Nile current, is flowing south against you if you're trying to go upstream, but the prevailing wind is from the north, so the wind would be blowing against you as well as the current. So it would be impossible to go upstream except by towing the boat, or except by going in the summer when the prevailing winds are in the south. So it was a very remote place, and there were not even any Egyptian, as far as we know, communities between Jebel Barkal and Kerma. But it was an important place because it was just south of the mouth of the Fourth Cataract. It was just downstream from the mouth of the Fourth Cataract, and the Egyptians built a fort there as a defense, and they believed that the primeval Amun lived inside this mountain. And it marked the upper limit of the Egyptian empire. But the odd thing about Thutmose's stela is that, well, let's go to the next slide. Every every monument from Jebel Barkal, going back to the stela of Thutmose, shows there were two forms of Amun that are associated with the mountain. There is and they always have the same directional place. On the left-hand side, you see a fully human Amun, and on the right-hand side, you see a ram-headed Amun. And these were the two aspects of Amun that were believed to dwell inside the mountain as one god. I mean, it's odd, but they saw Amun of Karnak in Thebes as a fully human being, and then the Amun of Nubia, or Amun of Jebel Barkal, was ram-headed, and they symbolized directions, and they also symbolized time. Amun of Karnak was the present god, the present form of the god. He was the god, the sort of the universal god, and the Amun of Jebel Barkal was the primeval god, the god that at the beginning of time created himself. He created divine kingship. He set the world in motion. He created the other gods. He caused the Nile to flow, and of course he did this annually. Every year, he caused the Nile to flow, because the Nile comes from the far, far south. They imagined a primeval aspect of Amun who set this flood in motion each year, which brought life and fertility to the Nile Valley. And so let's see. One concept that the Egyptians had about God and kingship and about human life, they believed that all creatures descended from what was called the Ka. The Ka was a kind of ancestral spirit. So the Amun of Jebel Barkal was the ancestral spirit or essence of Amun of Karnak. He was the beginning. Same, and since the Ka of Amun was also the generator of divine kingship, the royal Ka, that is the original kingship, the original essence of kingship, personified, lived with Amun of Jebel Barkal. And on the Jebel, I mean, this is what hasn't really been very well appreciated by Egyptologists, I think. Even though Amun in Egypt is considered to be the god of kingship, and of course, oh gosh, well, I'll explain this a little bit more later when I can show you some slides. But yeah. The really incredible thing is that in the Jebel Barkal stela of Thutmose III, found at Jebel Barkal, over the head of the Amun of Jebel Barkal, it's written that he gives the king the kingship of Upper and Lower Egypt, or the kingship of the two lands, whereas Amun of Karnak gives the king all foreign lands. But it's the kingship that comes from Amun of Jebel Barkal, and this is rather strange.
Sorry for interruption. Is that kingship he's giving is for both Upper and Lower Nubia?
Egypt.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, to the, I mean, by this time, I think Jebel Barkal was considered to be part of Upper Egypt. In fact,
Oh,
on the Tombos stela of Thutmose I, he talks about his conquests are not expanding Egypt, but he says they're expanding Thebes. So he considered all of his conquests to be expanding Thebes. And of course, that makes sense if you're going to put the Theban Amun at Jebel Barkal. Well, let's see here. The most striking thing about Jebel Barkal, I mean, there are lots of mountains along the Nile Valley, but the most unique thing about the mountain is its pinnacle on the south corner. And this monumental natural formation is about 75 meters high. And let me see. So when you see Jebel Barkal like this, like the ancients did, this fit perfectly into their mythological idea of the place of creation. It was called the primeval mound. They believed that creation took place on a mound, an isolated mound that rose up from the waters that covered the earth. And on that mound, the god pulled himself up out of the water, and he masturbated, and by masturbating, he gave birth to the first gods, Shu and Tefnut. But so this was his act of creation. The way the ancients conceived it was a man lying on a hillside, pleasuring himself, and this became the idea of the creator god. The thing is, the creator god was because he was alone and by himself. He couldn't just be male. He had to be male and female to make something. So they imagined the creator god as both male and female. In Heliopolis, near Cairo, the god Atum, Re Atum, was imagined. He was called the great he-she, and Amun himself, in this form, was called Kamutef. Kamutef. The bull of his mother. Now, the word Ka means bull, and it indicated a male sexual being. So, and the king was called the bull too. So the god was called the Ka, meaning bull, and the king sometimes was called the bull. But Ka also meant the ancestral essence, and was shown with another hieroglyph, which was two arms upraised. So the primeval Amun was shown in this manner over here on the left, with a giant erection, but he symbolized all in one, the male essence, the female essence, and the child, because he could create himself. So he was both of his parents, and he was also his child. And so each king was imagined to be the son of Amun, was also the Ka, the holder of the Ka. And in order to access the divine essence of kingship, each king was thought to have to go to wherever the god was and unite with him. This is the way Luxor Temple is imagined. But as I'll explain below, I think Luxor Temple is a substitute temple, a substitute sacred place built at Thebes as a substitute for Jebel Barkal, because it's occupied by the same primeval Amun that occupies Jebel Barkal. Well, let's go on. The pinnacle, let's take a look at this pinnacle. It's a kind of unique natural wonder in the Nile Valley. It doesn't, there's nothing like it anywhere else. And so right away, the ancient people saw this mound, this primeval mound at the very near the mouth of the second cataract, that fourth cataract, I mean, and they saw this formation, and they saw this as the phallus of the god, the symbol of his presence and his fertility as the ultimate male. He was known as Father of Fathers, and this is his essence as Father of Fathers. On the other hand, they could see in the rock other things like a rearing uraeus, a rearing cobra, and this was a symbol of a goddess. So if you see here, for example, in this on the left, you see a drawing of the relief. Where is my? You see a drawing of Amun of Jebel Barkal sitting inside the mountain. This is a relief in the B300 temple at Jebel Barkal, and shows Amun, ram-headed, and Mut. We're looking at them upstream, and from the cliff hangs this enormous uraeus with the sun disk. Here is a picture of it. And this is what they saw in the pinnacle, looking from the downstream side toward the upstream. They saw it as the goddess, well, a number of goddesses associated with the uraeus of the god himself. It was Hathor, it was Isis, it was Mut. From the other direction, if you're standing on the northeast side of the mountain looking downstream, it looks like they could see in it a uraeus with an Upper Egyptian crown. So it was the uraeus of the king. So in one rock formation, they could see that this had all of the goddesses combined within it. It had all of the great goddesses who were associated with the god's uraeus. It had all the goddesses of the king's uraeus, and so they were all combined within this one rock, which is the very essence of the word Ka. The Ka is like the source of all creation. And it's the source. If you take the pinnacle as the Ka, it's the source of all the gods. It's the source. There's an inscription of Taharka at Karnak where he says, where he describes Amun as the one through whose manifestations all manifestations manifest themselves. In other words, he was everything. And here he is. He's everything. He's male. He's female.
Yeah.
He's all the goddesses in one. And he's the phallus of fertility. But of course, the other thing is that what else is he? He's the king. He's his own child. So you look at this rock formation and you see a kind of a vague figure wearing the white crown. So he's let me go a little bit there. He's the royal Ka. He's the first king and the first king would be Osiris, right?
Right.
So, so this rock symbolized everything, and it symbolized all aspects of Amun. So it gave proof to them visually in their way of thinking that here was the birthplace of Amun, and it was also the primeval mound on which where creation had begun. And it was just looking at this picture, you can see that it had to be, in their minds, it had to be the source of kingship, had to be, and we're only talking about 18th dynasty Egyptians. We're not looking earlier than that because we don't know anything. But everything the Egyptians were seeing in the early 18th dynasty indicated that they believed this was the source of Amun and the source of kingship. Well, you can also see that that they could. We don't have any evidence directly. I mean, we don't have any images of the uraeus represented as a lower Egyptian uraeus, but you can almost make out the shape of the red crown. Let's see if I can, the shape of the red crown here, which would indicate a uraeus of Lower Egypt. And later on, when we see the Kushite crown, we see that they believed that they owned the right to rule Lower Egypt as well as Upper Egypt. And I think that that it was the pinnacle here. You can see a uraeus here faintly. And of course, wearing the red crown. And then of course, these urae symbolized goddesses. And of course, you see the goddesses becoming human, taking human heads with their uraeus bodies. So again, the pinnacle symbolized the male aspects, the female aspects, and the royal aspects of the god. And and at Jebel Barkal itself, what do we see right in front of the pinnacle? We see three temples. Two of them still exist. This one, B1100, has practically all disappeared, but it stood there. This was the temple of the uraeus goddesses, the royal uraeus goddesses, built right in front of the pinnacle. We have an inscription that identifies the temple as the temple of the uraeus goddesses, and both of them, there are two shrines within, and each of them belong to one of the two royal uraeus goddesses. So it's clear that the Kushites and definitely the Egyptians, saw in the pinnacle the the giant effigy of the royal uraei, and over here on the left are the temples of Hathor and Mut. So the pinnacle clearly was identified with the goddesses. Well, let's see. If you look at the face of Jebel Barkal, you can see that it has not just one sort of statue-like promontory, but it has four. Can you see these, what look like statues on the face of Jebel Barkal?
Yeah,
Now,
looks like
back in the 1930s, there was a British official named Titherington who looked at the mountain and said there wasn't, I mean, in the 1930s, they were beginning to think that these were really the remains of ancient statues. And so he said, look, there are four statues, just like Abu Simbel. And if you look in the middle, between them, you'll find a rock-cut temple, just like at Abu Simbel. Well, well, actually, no. They are natural formations, completely, that's positive. But in ancient times, it's clear that they saw them as four statues too, because at Merowe, there's a tomb chapel. I forget the number. N11 maybe, I think. But here's a picture of the king in the 3rd century BC, worshiping 4 gods seated on a mountain. And they're not in the mountain, they're sitting on the mountain. So and what are the different gods? So on the left is a god which is a uraeus, just like the pinnacle. And then who do you see but Hathor, Isis, just like the goddess in B200. And then you see the goddess Weret Hekau. She's the goddess of the royal crowns, which would be the goddess in B1100. The 2 royal uraei, in other words, are embodied within her. And finally, you have the great god represented as Re Atum. It actually talks about Atum, Re Atum here. So that would be Amun. He's the same. So here you have the king worshiping all the gods in the mountain, and they seem to be identified with these 4 promontories, but not necessarily in a rigid order. They're just their essences are distributed around in all of these rock formations. That's the way I would read it. But what you notice here is that the axis, we're looking on the left, we're looking right down the axis of the great Amun temple, you see? And what do you, the temple is aligned, where's my cursor?
You can see it, yeah. Go up, go up a little bit up. Yes,
oh,
that's
there
it.
it is, there it is. This figure, you can almost see a head here, and you see an arm upraised. Can you see that?
Yeah, there's something looks like, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, like the calf
Yeah.
or 2 hands, yeah.
Well, and of course the temple is aimed directly at this figure, not the pinnacle. It's just aimed at this figure. So who is he? He is Kamutef. And this is usually in Egypt, Kamutef has his other arm raised, his right arm upraised, holding the flail. But in this image from Kawa, we have an image of him with his left hand raised, just like here.
Right.
So it's clear that somebody wanted to show him the way he was, I think, here. Then we have other evidence. We have a graffito from the west side of the mountain showing the god inside the mountain, you see?
Yeah,
In front of the mountain is this ram-headed uraeus with arm upraised, holding a flail, just like Kamutef.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this bronze was found in B700 at Jebel Barkal. So here you see this. So Amun himself becomes a uraeus and can be associated with the pinnacle. So he's associated with the pinnacle in his phallic form, and of course, you know, he's also all these goddesses. He's also the king.
Yeah.
Well, let me see. Let's see where we're going here. Well, okay. The interesting thing about the god Amun is that he appears, even in Egypt, he appears almost out of nothing, you know, in the late second and first intermediate period, 11th dynasty, early 11th dynasty, 10th dynasty. He appears at Thebes for the first time, so he's a kind of a brand new god, and becomes the city god of Thebes and the royal god, as the Theban dynasty became to to control all of Egypt. But an earlier form of Amun didn't really exist until the Thebans expropriated the form of an ancient god called Min. And the ancient form of Min was exactly the form of Kamutef. This is one of the earliest images of Amun as Kamutef. And he's the primeval Amun. But this is the way Min was usually represented: a man with two feathers on his head, with a long streamer behind. And one of Min's strange accoutrements is this odd-looking temple, which looks like a phallus, or it looks, dare I say it, looks like the pinnacle on Jebel Barkal. And in front of the temple of Min is a pole with a standard of a bull horns, symbolizing the Ka, and it's called the Ka. And the temple is called a Sehenet. And it's peculiar to Min. Now, who is Min? Where did Min come from? Well, Min is one of the oldest gods known in Egypt. He first appears in rock drawings in the middle of the 4th millennium out in the eastern desert. And usually he's shown as a man, a crude human figure with 2 tall plumes on his head, holding a bull, symbolizing a Ka. And he's always ithyphallic. And the oldest images of Min, the oldest statues of Min, were found at Coptos, which are 2 of them are in the Ashmolean Museum and one's in the Cairo Museum, and they are huge. Well, I guess they're about 3 meters high, and they showed that they had detachable phalli, and in the right hand, the god held a flail that could be inserted here. And one of them is inscribed with the name of Narmer. So we know that these date to at least as early as the 1st dynasty. But Min, like Kamutef, was believed to be a self-created god. He was both his father and his own son. His mother was, his consort was Isis. Just like Osiris. So he was sort of associated with Osiris, and he was a personification of Horus, namely the living king. But he was the symbol of the divine source of kingship. And even in the New Kingdom, Kamutef had taken over this role Amun had taken over his role, and at the Ramesseum and at Medinet Habu, there's a ritual called the Festival of Min, but it's really about Amun, and it seems that Amun, in these scenes, Amun is given black skin, and the person who reads the ritual is a Puntite. Now, and he's followed by a procession of all of the kings of Egypt, going back as far as Menes, indicating that the origin of the kingship comes from this god who's associated with the far south, Punt, and actually Nubia. We know from texts going back in the Middle Kingdom that Min was a god venerated by the Eastern Desert people, the Medja. He's the god of the Red Sea coast. He's the god of Punt. He's the god of what was called God's land. And even these Coptite uh, colossi have figures carved on the legs showing African animals like elephants, ostriches, and shells from the Red Sea coast, indicating even in the fourth millennium that the Egyptians identified Min as a southern African Nubian Puntite deity that they shared. So it seems like the Egyptians and the Nubians shared this god. That he became a god of Coptos and Akhmim, both Upper Egyptian cities, and these were places where the roads across the desert led to the Red Sea, and these were like receiving places for all the goods of Punt. Well, if you look on the earliest stele from the Red Sea port of Wadi Gawasis, the Min is shown here like Amen-Kamutef, but he's actually Min before he became Amen. And here's a Sehenet. So you see his temple, his peculiar form of temple, is a very, very tall cylindrical form with a little doorway. Then here you see him again in a Middle Kingdom stela from Egypt. Here's Min, and here's his temple, a shrine, and then in front of the shrine is this tall thing. Again, this conical thing that looks an awful lot like the Jebel Barkal pinnacle. And here you see other drawings of Sehenets. And of course, the whole concept of Min as a self-created god and Kamutef as self-created gods seems to be implicit in this rock formation. Well, we have ethnographic evidence from the Nuba Mountains that in the 1930s, peoples in the Nuba Hills were worshiping phallic-shaped stones like this, like this, like this. They identified these stones as sources of fertility. They were, of course, phallic symbols, but they identified them with primeval ancestors. They identified them also with snakes and with cobras specifically. So these rocks, just like Jebel Barkal, the pinnacle on Jebel Barkal, these rocks had multiple identities, all in one. Ancestor, fertility source, snake, and they were both male and female. Well, here's a picture of Luxor Temple at Thebes. Now, Luxor Temple is 3 kilometers approximately south of Karnak. And the thing about it, it differs from Karnak in that its orientation is north to south. It's parallel to the Nile. And it was built, the earliest we know is that it was built in the reign of either Thutmose I or Hatshepsut. And what do we know about Thutmose I? He was the first pharaoh to actually traverse Upper Nubia, as far as we know. He went all the way to Kyrgyz near the Fifth Cataract and left a monument there where incidentally we find the earliest representation of Amen with a ram head. And this is the form of Amen that later became associated with Jebel Barkal. And we also find that underneath his image, his name is written out Amen-Kamutef. So if Kamutef was the source of the royal Ka, and Kamutef was a form of Min, and Kamutef's name was on the Kyrgyz inscription, in which the bulls are shown going downstream. The bull hieroglyph is shown written going from upstream to downstream, and the picture of Amun is looking the other way. It looks like they imagined the royal Ka and the primeval Amun to be associated with wherever the Nile came from. And the Nile came obviously from further upstream. So naturally, the origin of the king then would have to come from further upstream in their minds. So, so because it was important for them in their belief that for the king to unite with his Ka, or it became much more important after they discovered Jebel Barkal and discovered Upper Nubia, they realized that they needed to make it easy for the king to access his Ka. And so instead of traveling 2 months upstream to get to the god, they would simply bring the god to Thebes, build him a new temple, put him in there. And so they had a ritual called the Opet Festival, where the king and Amun of Karnak would travel by a boat procession from Karnak to Luxor. And inside Luxor temple, the king and the god united with their Ka, with their ancestor, and were thought to be reborn by this union. And the amazing thing is that the Amun of Luxor temple and the Amun of Jebel Barkal appear to be identical. Here on the right, you see Amun of Jebel Barkal, and here on the left, you see a relief in the British Museum where this Amun is called the god of southern sanctuary, which is the name of Luxor. And the inside Luxor temple, the culmination of the Opet festival, where the king has reunited with his Ka, the culmination is a coronation. And here you see Amun crowning Amenhotep III in one of these scenes. What does this show? It shows the king here. I've lost my, oh, there he is. It shows the king here being crowned with an Atef crown. This fantastic thing on his head is called an Atef, with two cobras, the two uraei, and on the top is probably Re, the sun god, a hawk with a sun disk on his head. The Atef crown is identified in several texts as the crown of the first time. It symbolized creation. When a king put the crown on, it meant that he was going back to the moment of creation. So he was being reborn. So by uniting with Amun in Luxor temple, the king was reborn as if at the beginning of time, which is where you would find the Ka. He was uniting with the original essence of kingship. And if you notice on his crown, you can see a ram horn. You see that curling ram horn? Inside Luxor temple, that's the only trace of the ram-headed Amun. Even though outside the temple we have images of Amun of Luxor as a ram, inside the temple, nothing. He's always shown he's either shown as a human, fully human like this, or as Kamutef. But here we see that he's gone back to the beginning of time and he has grown ram horns. And it looks like that means that he has been born of the primeval Amun at Jebel Barkal. Well, so if Luxor Temple was built by the Egyptian kings to make it easy for them to access the Amen of Jebel Barkal, and if it's sort of a ritual substitute at Thebes for Jebel Barkal, we look at the great Defufa at Kerma and we wonder if the Kerma kings themselves didn't build the great Defufa as a ritual substitute for Jebel Barkal. We know that the Defufa at Kerma was built and rebuilt many times, so it took centuries for it to reach this size. But we know that it was considered to be the home of a god. It had a stairway up to the top, and for much of its existence, it had a rounded extension on its downstream wall, and it looks like this downstream semicircular extension was a base for a kind of an obelisk or a monolith of some kind. And so in a way, they have a kind of similar appearance. And on the right, you see that at the base of the Defufa, the Kerma people built a number of small temples, and it looks very much like Jebel Barkal as it did in Egyptian times. So I'm believing that Jebel Barkal was a sacred site long before the Egyptians got there. And I believe this is proof that, and I suspect that the Egyptians took over Jebel Barkal, took control of this religious sanctuary in order to control the Nubian god. And if the Nubian god was actually Min, then he'd already been united with Amen 500 years before by the Egyptians at Thebes. So it was like the Egyptians rediscovering the original birthplace of Amen Min, a god that the Nubians had already worshipped for perhaps 1,000 years or more. And that for both peoples, the Egyptians and the Kermans, that they recognized Jebel Barkal as the source of their kingship. Perhaps both kings believed that they were his sons. And we have evidence of this a bit at Kerma by the fact that we find their relics of little rams wearing top knots, solar top knots on their heads. Many of the tombs at Kerma, in many of the tombs were found bodies of sacrificed goats with buried as full-bodied with ostrich feather pom-poms on their heads, just like the Amen with the solar discs of the Egyptian times. Well, finally, we come to a memory of well, let's see. From the Second Intermediate period, we have this stela from Buhen showing a Kerma king holding a bow, wearing a white crown. And most Egyptologists have assumed that the Kerma king simply appropriated an Egyptian symbol for their own and were pretending to be Upper Egyptian rulers. But is that really the way it happened? Or was the white crown always a Nubian crown? And if so, what would cause the crown to have this strange shape? Because it's not a type of crown that would be easy to wear as a type of headwear. And the only as a person who's excavated, spent so much time at Jebel Barkal, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the white crown shape was inspired by the pinnacle shape, and it was a symbol that the living king identified himself with the mythical king that came from the primeval god of the mountain. And this symbolized his descent from that god. And I mean, I would say that both the Egyptians and the Nubians were doing the same thing, and that they were both in competition. In the Second Intermediate period, they were both in competition for control of Upper Egypt. Well, we actually have some evidence of this from Diodorus, the historian, the Greek historian of the 1st century BC, who wrote in his history a tradition that he got from the Ethiopians, namely the Sudanese of those days. He says that these informants, who are Meroitic ambassadors, told him that the Egyptian civilization was simply an offshoot of their own civilization. He said the Egyptians were settlers from among them, and that Osiris was their leader. In other words, Osiris, the first Egyptian king, was really a Nubian. And then he added that they shared. Oh, what have I done?
It's back.
Okay. Where are we here?
Good, down there.
Here we go. And he said one of the things they shared in common was the kings of both countries wear tall, pointed felt hats ending in a knob with snakes that they call the asp coiled around them. So in other words, in the 1st century BC, Diodorus was saying that Egyptian civilization, according to the Nubians, Egyptian civilization came from Nubia, and that one of the things they shared in common was the white crown. And that, if I'm correct in my theory, it would seem like the white crown became a symbol of southern Egyptian and Nubian kingship already in the 4th millennium BC. And then what happens in the 8th century, in the late 8th century, is that a new dynasty, a new Kushite dynasty emerges, which believes that it has the right to control all of Egypt. And they adopt a new crown called the cap crown. And the cap crown has 2 uraei, Upper and Lower Egypt, each crowned with the respective crown. But if you look at this, you see that this crown is inspired by the shape of Jebel Barkal. The very sharply coiling snakes here leave a ridge, and you can see the ridge here, and you can see the crown here. So it seems like the Kushites are saying that their royal authority comes from Amun of Jebel Barkal, comes from Jebel Barkal, and that their crown, they, just as the god lives in the mountain, hidden, when they put the crown on themselves, they are putting on the mountain, and they themselves are inside the mountain. The Kushite kings, his sons, are the living manifestations of God, and they have the authority to rule Upper and Lower Egypt. And you can almost suspect that they are reliving or acting out politically a tradition that was probably known by both Egyptians and Nubians, since the 4th millennium BC. And that the conclusion, if I'm right in all of this, the conclusion is that Upper Egyptian kingship in the beginning the concept of Kamutef, the concept of Min, the ancient god of kingship, comes from Jebel Barkal. End of story.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tim. That was really very interesting kind of theories about Jebel Barkal and the origin of kingship there at Jebel Barkal, and that ongoing, debate between the always among the public and the scholars too about the origin of the kingship.
Do you think I dare title my book "The Nubian Origin of Egyptian Kingship"?
I think it will work. It's gonna trigger like a lot of discussion, of course. It's definitely have like a lot of discussion, and it triggers a lot of discussion. But so that's why I wanted to ask you a question about how do the Egyptians look at the source of their kingship?
What?
Egyptologists in general, do they go that deep in the
no.
theology? And
there's no solution but this. There isn't. I mean, nobody knows why a crown of this shape. Nobody knows what the meaning of this Sehaned is. No, but nobody's ever. I mean, this isn't published yet, so nobody has had a chance to
look at the source
about it. I mean, it's a rather shocking, kind of
interpretation. Yeah,
turns the world upside down a little bit.
Yeah, it's gonna change for the whole history along like River Nile. I mean, people probably think about most of the public that the earliest state, but it's not that. For me, it's not that the big issue at this moment when we talk about the origin of the or the source of the kingship itself. It's the two different separate things about the complexities and the origin of the source of the kingship itself. I
think that Egyptologists don't really imagine that people that early Egyptians were familiar with territory so far south. I think that their perspective doesn't go as far south as Jebel Barkal, but there's a lot of archaeological evidence that shows that there are connections between particularly in the Eastern Desert peoples were roaming far to the south and up as far as Upper Egypt. So these were nomads, and in the 4th millennium BC, the deserts weren't so completely uninhabitable. I mean, they were seasonal savanna ranges where people could roam freely with their herds and cover vast distances. And my suspicion is that if they were worshiping the god Min, they could travel they could take their god with them and build his special temple out of portable materials, and it was like a substitute for Jebel Barkal.
Oh, interesting. So you came up with slides from the Nuba Mountain talking about also the same the god Min probably to worship there, but we don't have that much, of course, archaeological research at that area. But we have ethnographic data from there. So do you think the connection between there's a kind of connection also between the River Nile and the West at that time, for example, especially when it comes to the deities of
I mean, there's I have to plead that my knowledge, my own knowledge is limited. I mean, I've read about the Darfur palaces and the round architecture of some of the early sultans, and there's a kind of similarity between that and the Duki Gel architecture.
Yeah, and what Benega too.
And Wedbinaga, oh well, yeah, there's that round building.
Round building, yeah.
That's another story. That's part of the um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of data that needs to be examined, and maybe this will force the next generation of scholars to look harder in this direction.
So um, I just have a short question about the king united with his car. So so that's I can imagine that the Egyptian king, that was very hard for them to come all the way to upstream in order to get the king united with the but that's with the car in the south, right? So was that the cases all the time when it comes to the procession there in Egypt, or it was just occasionally happen?
Say that again,
I
Mohammed?
mean, you said there's a procession if there the king would need to you get united with the car, right?
Oh yeah. Well,
So was that the cases in most of the all the when it comes to the kingship and the the kingship ceremonies and procession and things like that? Did they need to travel all the way to the south?
well, I mean, I think that the idea to be a true king of all of this land, it was probably important for the king to travel at least once to Jebel Barkal, probably no more than once. I mean, we do know that most of the kings, I think, there's a good possibility that they visited the site once. But once Luxor Temple was built, they didn't really they
Need
didn't
to
need to they could do it every year just by visiting him at Luxor.
uh,
And
substitute.
and it was it worked, until the 21st dynasty, when Jebel Barkal was lost to Egyptian control, and when the kings were cut off from Jebel Barkal, um, it seems like suddenly they didn't have the divine power anymore. They were not taken seriously. They were they didn't have the white crown, and so I think that that's why maybe the kings of the second intermediate period did not have the prestige, because they were, as Bianchi says in his stela, you know, people, men can make a king, and people can make a king, but Amen made me.
This is greater.
So there could be petty kings, made by because they had a little local power, but they weren't sons of the god. They didn't have Kas, and they couldn't access the Ka because they couldn't get to Jebel Barkal. And who gets the Ka again? The 25th dynasty kings. And that's the next time you see Luxor temple occupied. Between the end of the New Kingdom and between the 25th dynasty, I think there are a few high priests names carved on lintels and things, but no king claimed the royal Ka, as far as I know. So, and of course, uh, the 25th. I mean, there's a whole history of this. Once by the 26th dynasty, you have the kings claiming descent from Amen and Karnak, and you have the Kushites claiming descent from Amen at Jebel Barkal. but of course, after the end of the 6th century, it's just foreigners that are kings of Egypt, whereas in the Sudan, you have a native monarchy that goes on, forever.
Yeah, yeah. going back to the words forever, I'm gonna go back to Kerma. You just showed like a slide from Bohane showing the one of the Kerman kings with the same crown, probably the white crown too.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's a thriller from Buhan.
from Bohane, yeah,
It's in the National Museum, Khartoum.
in Khartoum, yeah. So does that mean that was the source for the kingship for during the Kerma kingdom too?
Let me hold on.
Is
Uh, Shut that off. Yeah. Is that, I
it,
mean,
uh-huh.
at Kerma you have the Defufa, which was the temple of the god, and then out in the cemetery you have royal chapels, tomb chapels that look like the Defufa, that have that are the same size and the same features. So it looks like
Substitute
the
of
kings and the god are almost the same. Um, and then you have also this row of what Bonnet calls Ka chapels in the city. So it looks like the kings were worshipped after death in the city, and of course, they had these grandiose tombs and tomb chapels. I don't know if they were actually entered and worshipped. I mean, were they temples or were they storehouses for royal goods before the burial? Nobody knows. But they were identified with the sun because there are lintels. There's one lintel that shows a winged sun disk over the doorway with Uraei. So it looks like the Kerma kings and the Egyptian kings were sharing a lot of concepts and iconography, and it seems almost certain that they were worshiping some form of the same god.
at that time. Yeah. So it just came to my mind one little question about the Kerman at that time. Why would they build like that massive structure to substitute the Jebel Barkal there if the Jebel Barkal wasn't that far and was accessible probably for the Karma people at that time? And
Well,
how much evidence do we have from Jebel Barkal showing that that kind of connection between the two places, for example, as a religious center
that's a
or
good
source of,
question.
you know. Mhm.
Um, let's see. I think the Jebel Barkal was an important site because it was identified as the with all of its features. It identified the home of the god, but it wasn't in a very convenient location for a royal capital. Kerma was a very important place because it was at the confluence of a lot of trade routes and the river route, and but Jebel Barkal was not a place where you could control um, a major part of the Nile. It was not very well populated. It was cut off because of the river, the difficulty of navigation. It was probably mainly accessible only by an overland um, road, from Kerma. And probably there wasn't a major sanctuary there. I mean, most of these Nuba sites are just maybe small little huts. I mean, for example, uh, I think Bruce Williams wrote an article about caves, the importance of caves, and at Jebel Barkal there might have been a cave right underneath the pinnacle, which later became the B300 temple. There might have been an original cave where there was a priest or a shaman
Mhm.
or kujur, as they say.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
um, um, So it might have been just something like that. And maybe the Kerma king went to Jebel Barkal for a ritual coronation. We don't know. There are no Kerma remains that have been excavated or found so far, and we found very few Kerma sherds. But we do have a range of sherds of all the Nubian. We have C group, Pangrave, and Kerma and pre-Kerma, and wavy line Neolithic sherds from the site. So it was occupied for a long time.
That's pretty interesting. So I'm sorry I'm taking it too long with you. I know, but it's very exciting to ask you a few more questions probably about the later period. For example, during Meroitic period too. How do we see Jebel Barkal at that time too? Was it taking still maintaining the same ritual and kinship, source of kinship also during the later period? I mean, like during the Meroitic time?
Oh, in the Meroitic time. Well, in the Meroitic times, it was a big complex. It was a royal. Um, I mean, of course, it remained the center of important coronations. I think there was probably an annual coronation, just like there was at Luxor. And I think the kings, I think Laszlo Turek suggested an ambulatory kingship, a kingship where the king is constantly traveling from one city to another to celebrate coronations, New Year rituals. And there was a huge palace constructed in the 1st century at Jebel Barkal. So it's evident that the king and queen must have, in the royal family and the court, must have spent a lot of time there. And they also restored all the Natakamani and Amanitore restored all of the old temples for the last time. And in fact, the last restoration of the B1100, which is the temple of the Uraeus goddesses, was restored by Amanitore. At least her name survives there. And so it's clear that they were doing coronations probably until maybe the 3rd century AD, when the site seems to have been destroyed by an earthquake. Temples were heavily damaged at that time, and probably at that time the site was no longer. I mean, it went out of use. Some of the temples became homes for squatters. So there we have it.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Hey.
It is good to have you really in our short interview program, but this is not short, of course. And we would love to see you again, and in our program is going to be live the next time. And I'm sure that a lot of people are going to be involved with a lot of discussions, especially when it comes to the source of
Well, I'd love to have some feedback. This should excite the Sudanese audience.
Of course, yeah, I'm sure that
Nationalism,
exactly. Especially there are many questions coming from that side,
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tim Kendall, for your work, and hopefully to see you in Sudan again,
Pleasure.
probably next coming season.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. So long. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.